Hi there, it is Jo from Minerva, and today I'm here to do a little chit chat about different types of sewing thread. When I actually looked at all the different sewing threads that I had more than I thought because I've been sewing with lots of different fabrics lately, so I've been trying to match my thread to my fabric type. If you've just been starting out in your sewing journey, then you've probably been getting on perfectly well with some Polyester Sewall thread. So a Gutterman thread. It's called a Polyester Sewall, and it's got polyester and cotton mix, and it's suitable for most sewing projects, and you can be getting along with that thread for years and years and years. And if you're sewing cottons and woven fabrics, then this is the go-to thread for your sewing projects. It comes in a huge range of colours, but if you don't know the thread shade number, then you can ask Minerva to use their thread matching service, and they will give the best match for the fabric that you choose. It's important to have matching thread on your bobbin and your reel on the top. So I don't mean matching in colour, you might change the colours, but you need to have the same sort of thread on the top and the bottom, because if one thread is thicker than the other, it will pull on the tension and one will keep breaking, and you'll have a discrepancy in tension between the two threads. This is one of the first things to check out if you're having some stitch problems with your sewing machine. Gutterman also do a cotton thread, which you might choose if you can't wear polyester. Polyester mix in the also thread does give it its strength, so cotton thread isn't quite as strong. It doesn't last so long either, because cotton will eventually degrade. Cotton threads are not colour fast either, so when you wash your garment when it's finished, you may get some bleeding from your pattern print into your cotton, and it will dye your cotton. It's a good choice if you want to tie-dye something or dye something a bit further down the road of the garment. So the cotton will take on the colour dye, whereas a polyester won't. You might have found that if you've tried to dye a ready-to-wear item, and then you find out that all the stitch lines are really, really prominent. That's because the thread is not made of cotton too. Cotton thread also shrinks, so just like when you pre-wash a piece of woven cotton fabric like linen or a cotton or any of those sort of natural fibres, you'll get a slight shrinkage, and you will get the same with a cotton thread. It's often not used by quilters because when they wash their quilts, they don't want to lose all of those thread lines that they've put in really carefully. Cotton thread resists heat really well, so you can, that's why it's used with woven fabrics and natural fibres like cotton and linen, that you can press on a very high temperature, because you can also press your cotton thread in the seam lines without melting or damaging it. Of late, I've been using some sulky thread. This is actually a silky thread, but it's S-U-L-K-Y, and it has a really nice sheen to it. And I've been using it on my underwear sewing. So I've made a camisole, and I wanted to do a stitch line around the bottom, and it was a satiny fabric, so my thread matched the sheen of the fabric, and it looked really superb. This is also a fabulous thread if you're using a decorative stitch on your machine, because it's finer than normal thread, so it's very, very thin. And when you do the decorative stitch, so say like a scallop or something, then the threads get really, really close and you get a really nice sheen. Here's how it looks from your machine. You might use the sulky thread so that you get a silky sheen when you're sewing with a fabric with the same finish. So let's try on. This is a viscose satin, and I'm going to do a decorative stitch so that you can see how it smooths out and has a really nice finish. So with the silky finish, you get that nice sort of shine that matches the shine of the fabric. And because it's a very fine thread, it lines up really, really smoothly to get the pattern. Really good for a more open finish as well. And when that's pressed, it looks beautiful. I've used that stitch on a camisole strap in a similar fabric, So I had a satin camisole and I put that pattern along the straps. So that is a sulky thread. I've only got a little bit of this reel left, but this is a top stitching thread, which you might use if you're doing a lot of top stitching detail, if you're making jeans or a jean style skirt, pinafore, dungarees, any of those things where you're relying on a little bit of top stitching. It can be troublesome for some machines. You need to have this on the top of your machine and a normal thread on the bobbin, which is opposite to what I said before. But it does help if you have the thinner thread on the bottom. You can also use this for hand stitching details. So on the back of my jeans, as a hand stitching detail. So on these jeans, I did a sashiko pocket, and I didn't want it to be really thick and very handmade looking. So I used a top stitching thread to do the sashiko pattern on the pocket. I also used it for all of the top stitching details around the little mini pocket here, pocket tops, belt loops, etc. But you do need to test it first so that you can get your stitch length and stitch width right and your upper and lower tensions correct. You can check out a few more details on how to use top stitching thread in my sewing denim video, which is here on YouTube. It's on the playlist. If you look up sewing with denim, there's some really great tips on how to thread up your machine with top stitching thread. There's not as much thread on a top stitching reel, so for a pair of jeans you will definitely need 2 reels in your order. There's nothing worse than getting halfway through a pair of jeans and you've got a real sort of momentum going and you have to stop and wait for some more thread to arrive. Here is my thread nemesis, which is an invisible thread, and it always seems like a great idea, but it's really difficult to use. But in some cases, to match and get a great technique with your fabric, you might need to use it. So I've been making a prom dress and I've been using this beaded tulle, and I didn't use invisible thread in the machine because I can't see to thread it up and I can't see what's happening, but I do use it for reapplying beads. So where I'd taken some beads off in the seam line, I was able to put some of the bigger beads back on, and I also used it to hand sew down the seam allowances. So there's the side seam of this skirt and it's all attached down. So I've split the seam open and I've used invisible thread to hand stitch that down. It's a real couture finish, but you get a really ethereal seam finish without the bulk of 2 colours of tulle going to one side. So invisible thread is really useful if you're working with a beaded fabric and you're going to do some beading, or it might be useful if you're working with a tulle or a net. A new thread on the market is a Marlex thread, and it's a thread that's got a little bit of stretch. It's much finer than shearing elastic, so it really does mimic the width of an all-purpose thread, but it's got a slight stretch to it. So if you don't have an overlocker and you're making things with stretch knits on your sewing machine, then an investment in some Marlex thread is a great way forward, because you can use a long straight stitch and get a stretch in your seam, rather than trying to use a lightning stitch, which your machine might not have, or a very narrow zigzag, which works fine in a normal thread, but you can get a much better stretch with Marlex thread. Let's have a look at how it works. I'm loading up with some Marlex thread. You might be able to see I've marked my bobbin with a Sharpie so that it reminds me that's not just some normal white thread, that's a Marlex thread. Okay, let's give it a test. So this is a piece of stretch cotton jersey. It's got stretch in both ways, and we're going to sew a seam with a straight stitch, and I'm just going to lengthen the stitch length so that you can see the stitch line a little bit, but it is just a normal straight stitch. It's not a zigzag or any special stretch stitch. but the seam is still stretchy, and we can't hear it going pop like you would if you'd got a polyester thread in there. So it's absolutely ideal for making all your stretch knit patterns in stretch fabrics. Gives a really nice stitch line, whereas if you used a lightning stitch or a zigzag stitch, sometimes if that's a negative ease garment and it's stretched, you can see the stitches a little bit, but you get the advantage of sewing with a straight stitch, but the seam is still stretchy. If you're into making homeware, or you're making a special project, maybe garden seat covers, upholstery, all of that sort of hard wearing items, like bag making as well, then you can try an upholstery thread. It's really strong. It means that you can go through very thick layers of fabric and it doesn't break, but you will also need to match that with a sewing needle so you can get that thicker thread through the eye of a needle. If you have an overlocker, or you are a new user of an overlocker, then you've probably been having a go with using some cones that go on your overlocker. For ages, when I first had my overlocker, I thought you could only put cones on it. I spent quite a bit of money on getting cones in all different colours to go on my overlocker, which is fine because they last for ages and ages and ages. But actually, you don't have to have them on this style reel. You can put Gutterman threads on your overlocker. You can put Coates Moon threads on your overlocker. Sometimes there's just a little shaft that you take off so that it accommodates the circumference of the different reel sizes. These threads tend to be cheaper and less quality than a dressmaking thread because you're getting through lots and lots of it when you're overlocking. So you can buy sets of cones, but you can also use Coates Moon thread. Coates Moon threads are a sort of smaller version of a cone, so they have a polyester quality thread on them. It's normally 1,000 meters or so on them, sometimes more, and so they last a long time. But if you want to make the commitment to have lots of different colors, then that might be the way forward. It's okay for sewing, you know, for normal garment sewing. It's all right, but it's not quite as strong and as such good quality as Gutterman or Minerva thread. Another type of overlock thread that I've been trying out just recently is a Flock thread. It's really fine. Look, you can see it's got a sort of wisp on the end there where I've broken it off by hand. It's really strong. It's ideal for swimwear sewing, dancewear, gym wear, lingerie, because it's really fine. So when you use your overlocker and you get sort of layers of thread, it doesn't make a bulky seam. And it's also very hard wearing. Because it doesn't have any natural material content, it's actually very strong and it doesn't shrink. So it's great for sort of things that you wash over and over again, like underwear, because it won't disintegrate. And it is really fine. You get a really flat overlocker edge, rather than sometimes if you press something that's been overlocked, you get a little bit of bulk underneath with all those layers of thread. But this one is virtually invisible. Let's think about some hand stitching now. So some people ask me, I've got a beautiful box of old cotton reels or vintage threads that were my grandma's or my aunt's, or that somebody gave them, and they are very attractive. I mean, when you look at them, the shine on them is beautiful. They're much thicker threads and they are lovely, but a thread does have a shelf life and these won't be as strong. So if you try to sew these on your sewing machine, it will keep breaking. What I save these for is for any hand stitching, especially if I want to put a little bit of detail on something. They're fabulous for sort of freehand embroidery. If you've got a pair of jeans and you're going to make them all funky and put some flowers around the hems or something, these threads are perfect for that. So save them to look at, or save them for hand sewing, but they're not great in modern machines. If you have some cotton reels with particular sentimental value, then I recommend you use them for some form of decoration. This is a sewing wreath that I made, and I used some of the cotton reels from my grandma's sewing box. Then I can look at them and have them out all of the time, but I'm not having a disastrous sewing project. If you do enjoy hand sewing, this is a pearl thread, and they come in different numbers depending on their thickness. So this is a pearl 8 thread. This is ideal for sort of sashiko sewing, so it would have done the back pockets of my jeans. It's good for Alabama Shannon if you do the stretch jersey sort of leaf shapes and you sew around. It's great for quilting, so if you're hand quilting maybe a baby quilt together and you don't want to pucker it all up putting it through the sewing machine and you're just going to do some running stitches like you see on Cantha Indian quilts, then Pearl 8 is a perfect thread weight for that. It's slightly shiny, but it's slim enough to go through most sewing needles. We have this in all different colours. You might have seen a thread called Basting Thread, and for ages I thought, why would I need separate thread for basting? But actually it's really slim and it's really, really smooth. So if you baste something, you can pull the thread out really easily because the twist that you normally get in a thread catches on the fabric a little bit, but basting thread is really, really smooth. So if you're making a jacket or something with lots and lots of basting, a couture item, a special evening dress or something for a special event, then a little reel of basting thread might really help you because you can baste things together, pull out the thread, it doesn't leave thread holes or little marks in the fabric, and it's really, really smooth. Basting thread isn't made for its strength and durability. It snaps really easily, so you can pull it out, you can flick it out with your unpicker, and you're not really, really tugging something and damaging the garment that you've been putting together. You can also get a waxed thread, which does the opposite. So that's really, really strong. It's great for bag making and for making coats and outerwear. And that comes pre-waxed and it's a much thicker thread. It's on a reel with less yardage on it. But if you want just a little bit of waxed thread, which makes for really great thread for putting on buttons because it makes it so strong, you could try having a reel of beeswax. And beeswax comes in this little holder, and if you just use your normal Gutterman thread, but you run it through the beeswax, so you put the thread onto the beeswax through the gap and pull it, then you coat the thread in a little bit of beeswax and it stops it twisting. So when you're sewing a button and you're going over and over and over, sometimes your thread will start to twist, but the beeswax holds it all in place. There is one tiny nuance of beeswax. You need to make sure that you're waxing your thread as it comes off the reel, so don't wax it the opposite way or you can sort of damage the thread a little bit, but that's really tiny detail. But if a dressmaker was on here, they'd say you have to wax your thread in the correct direction. But wax thread really helps to sew on buttons, especially if you've got lots and lots and lots to do and the thread keeps twisting up. My final thing to say about choosing different threads is you'll only really be doing that if you're starting to choose different fabrics, but also to get the most success out of your fabric and thread combo, then you also need to have the right sewing machine needle. So I've got quite a few here because I use them as samples quite a lot. But you know, if you're using the silky thread, then you might need a sharps needle. If you're using Topstitching thread, then those are a game changer, the Topstitching needles, because the eye is bigger, so it doesn't shred the thread as it goes through the needle. And that's one of the key points that makes people lose their temper when they're using Topstitching thread, is the thread shears as it goes through the small eye of a needle. So Topstitching needles are a real must if you're going to be doing some top stitching. I haven't shown a metallic thread, but metallic needles are great for if you're using metallic thread in your machine for decorative stitching, because it that all shears off as well. So the foiling around the actual thread inside starts to peel off if it's going through an eye that's too small. So a metallic needle has a slightly larger hole and it has a different coating on the inside of the eye so that the thread can run through smoothly. If you're using the upholstery thread or a thicker thread for sewing leather, then choose a leather needle. This needle has a different shaped point, so it makes a little slice in the fabric as it goes in rather than a hole. And then as the hole closes back up again, you don't see lots of punch holes along your leather. And for the Marlex thread, then you'll be using a stretch or a ballpoint needle, depending on what type of jersey you've got, whether it's got high elastane or high lycra or it's a Ponte Roma. So you might need to test out both of those on your fabric before you start sewing. So if you're feeling like your sewing is moving on to the next level, you're choosing different fabrics, you're creating different decor effects, then it might be time to start branching out into some different types of thread. Hope today's little chit chat has helped you demystify some of those different products that we have on our website. Thank you very much for watching. Do call again soon.